The Deadlands, a Vythael tale. Legend says that the Deadlands are the remnants of the Jewel of Theos. The people traveled from all over to partake in the markets and entertainment in the city. Legend also says that it was hit the hardest by the breaking, and no one in the city survived. Or, if they did, they became hideous monstrosities that snuff out even the tiniest of lights. Are you sure we're going in the right direction? Ahvora fought the urge to smack her brother as he asked the same question for the third time since departing the cavern, where they'd reunited along with their sister Elevie. Ahvora cast a sidelong glance at Uriel, whose unkempt hair was swept back like a wave breaking on a beach. The bird led me to you, didn't it? True, but that could have just been coincidence, Uriel countered. How do we know it's not just leading us off a cliff? First of all, we're heading down the mountain, genius. Despite her annoyance, Ahvora was secretly thrilled to be arguing with Uriel again. For a short time, she could pretend the past few cycles hadn't happened, that everything was normal, and they were on their way south. Elevie once again rose to her station as the middle sibling and tried to mediate between her older sister and younger brother. It's the right way. I can feel it. She caught Ahvora staring at her and tried not to squirm. What? A defensive note crept into her tone. Ahvora shook her head. Nothing. Elevie's comment had given Ahvora pause. Once mentioned, she noticed that the pounding sensation in her head had lightened considerably. The headache had plagued her since the aftermath of what was quickly becoming known as the Breaking, the cataclysmic event that destroyed or mutated everything in its wake. She pushed aside the memories of desperately searching through the rubble after the earthquake in Heretta's artisan district and refocused on the present. Her siblings were safe and together, and that was all that mattered. The snow thinned with each turn of the path winding down the mountain until patches of earth began to peek out from under the white blanket. Evergreens towered around the small group as they traversed. The path disappeared from view completely in places, and the siblings had to rely on the skills of a companion named Akasi. He was able to detect a path through the dense brush, and his strangely bright blue hair was easy to follow. A large black bird with intelligent eyes always waited for them where the path reappeared. When the ground had all but leveled out just after a particularly troublesome detour, the raven perched on a rock. Its head tilted to one side, then the other, and it beat its wings a couple of times as the group came into view. I miss the light rails, Uriel bemoaned. He paused by a pair of large metal beams that had once proudly bore the railings, which served as conductors for the magic that levitated carriages across Theos. We'd already be in Levena if they still worked. Soren. Akasi turned to look back at Elevie. We are going to Soren still, yes? There was a strange intensity to his gaze, an additional unspoken question in his hazel eyes. A strange thought occurred to Ahvora that she was reluctant to voice. She glanced between her sister and the stranger and decided to throw caution to the wind. Her hand grazed Elevie's arm to get her attention. El, do you feel it too? That pull? Elevie's eyes, pale like raindrops, widened. It was all the confirmation Ahvora needed. She rounded on Akasi. And you? Akasi took an involuntary step backwards, but nearly slipped on a patch of ice. The clumps of hair jutting out from behind his ears shifted into a bright shade of purple, and he nodded. But he doesn't. Ahvora returned her eyes to Elevie, but gestured to Uriel. What are you all talking about? Uriel threw his hands up. What pull? Why would we be going to Soren when Levena is home? Will someone please tell me what's going on? His gaze shifted between his sisters. An awkward silence fell upon them, broken only by the sound of their breathing as translucent puffs curled into the air from their mouths. Ahvora finally broke the silence. It happened during, or maybe right after, the breaking. I felt the strange need to go to Soren, but I ignored it at first. She looked away as she trailed off. I tried to find you two first. I needed to know you were all right. There were so many bodies, I didn't even know if I'd recognize you. Clearing her throat, she added, It seemed like a miracle to hope for even one of you to be alive, let alone both. Guilt flickered across Elevie's face. We ran. We didn't know what else to do. Uriel placed one hand on Ahvora's shoulder and the other on Elevie's arm, though Ahvora couldn't tell if it was to reassure her or himself. Better to run than die, Akasi chimed in. There was a hint of unease in Elevie's voice as she said, I don't know if anything but luck saved us. A loud caw startled the group, and they all laughed nervously at their jumpiness. I suppose this one is tired of waiting on us. Uriel nodded in the direction of the bird, who was once again ruffling its feathers. So, we go to Soren then. And after whatever is there that's calling to you three, then we'll go home. Course of action agreed upon, the group set out, once more following the raven. Ahvora noticed Akasi and Elevie fall behind more than was necessary, but she tried to brush off whatever it was about the elf with the strange-colored hair that put her on edge. If Elevie trusted him, that would have to be good enough for Ahvora. The forest began thinning after a while, the ground covered in more leaves than the tree branches. Ahvora chalked it up to the oncoming cold of wind. Even the four travelers lowered their voices as they continued. always following the path of the raven, who would occasionally loop back to make sure they were still there. The bird had led them back onto a worn path and was no longer circling high above. Rather, it seemed to stay within 10 paces of the elves. Ahvora, having learned to hunt from a young age, picked her way carefully among the scattered branches littering the road. She wanted her bow in hand, but also felt it would alarm the others. "Wait," Akasi hissed. Ahvora froze. Yrel, who either hadn't heard or didn't care, kept going until Ahvora repeated the word with a sharper edge, as she had so many times during Yrel's childhood. "I think I detect something." Akasi took a few steps forward until he was beside Ahvora. The ends of the elf's hair had changed color again, this time to burnt sienna. It was a startling contrast to the earlier brightness. He knelt and picked up one of the thicker branches, putting one end under his foot. When he attempted to snap it, the section that ought to have cracked instead disintegrated, crumbling to the ground again in dusty ash. Elavi gasped. "What happened to it?" "Fire?" Yrel suggested. Both Akasi and Ahvora shook their heads. "This is something else," Akasi said. Ahvora unstrapped her bow from her pack at last. She slung the quiver of arrows over her shoulder, leaving the pack on the ground. "Wait here." She glanced at the raven, which had settled on the ground a few paces away. "If the bird comes back without me, take my pack and run. Is that all right with you?" she asked the raven, who bobbed its head. Turning back to her siblings, she said, "If I scream, run. If I say to run, do so." "Maybe I should go with you," Yrel interrupted before Ahvora could ramble any further. She flashed a quick grin. "You know I'm faster." She held out an arm, and the raven obligingly flew to her. Without waiting for a reply from a glowering Yrel, she disappeared into the shadows, only occasional crunch of leaves revealing her decreasing proximity. Ahvora forged ahead, her bow in hand and the raven on her shoulder. The bravado with which she'd spoken seeped out of her with every step that took her further from the others. Apart from her, nothing seemed to stir. The noise of the forest that had grown familiar during their journey was absent, as though she was trapped under a jar. The sight that greeted her as she broke through the tree line took her breath away. Clasping her hand over her mouth to stop herself from screaming, Ahvora stared in horror. Everything in front of her appeared to be stripped of its color. Charred remains of tree trunks were felled in random clusters, and nothing smaller remained on the blasted ground. Dark shapes loomed in the distance. Even with Ahvora's improved ability to see in the dark, she couldn't make out what they were. She took another step forward, her boots stirring up little clouds of ash. The only areas devoid of the gray powder were the fissures from where the earth tried to swallow everything. Chills ran up her spine. Ahvora turned her head slightly to glance at the raven. "Don't suppose you'd be willing to scout ahead?" Her words sounded muffled in the wake of destruction. The bird bobbed its head and took off, its sharp talons digging into Ahvora's shoulder as it launched into flight. It climbed into the air, wings beating hard as though fighting increased pressure. As she lost sight of the raven, she wondered about the wisdom of sending it off. She already felt lonelier with it gone. Ahvora planted her feet, hips distance apart, with a slight bend in her legs, and settled into wait. The stillness of the area caused the hair on the back of her neck to stand up on edge. Her legs were starting to feel numb by the time the raven reappeared, gliding at a downward angle. Feeling a little foolish, but unsure of what else to do, Ahvora asked, "Did you see anything that could be dangerous?" The raven ruffled its feathers, then stared at the elf, its head cocked to one side. "I take that as a no. Let's head back to the others." The bird once more flew to Ahvora's arm. It wasn't until they left the desolate area that Ahvora pinpointed what had been bothering her so much. Everywhere she'd ever been, there had always been some animals scurrying about. Even in the central city of Theos, Heretta, it was impossible to go anywhere without seeing birds overhead or running into someone's furred companion. But not there. She'd seen nothing but their bird guide. She reported the findings to her siblings and Akasi, and they followed her to the edge of the grayness. "I don't like this." Elavi shrinked back from where the land's decaying state began. "This isn't natural." The other three turned to stare at her. Noticing their gaze, her pale cheeks colored. "What? What part, since the breaking, has seemed natural?" Yrel shook his head as he spoke. Akasi placed a hand on Elavi's cloaked back, between her shoulders, a tender gesture that did not escape Ahvora's eyes. "Your brother speaks reason." Rather than comfort her, the words seemed to further annoy Elavi. "You know what I mean," she huffed. Without warning, she started forward, her boots kicking up the gray dust just as Ahvora's had. The others exchanged glances before following Elavi. They proceeded without speaking, the only noise being the sound of their feet hitting the ground, past where Ahvora had stood sentinel, until the shapes ahead came into focus. Twisted beams of metal jutted out at odd angles where the light rail stopped to load or unload passengers. Thick scorch marks covered fragmented remains of stone buildings where the powdery ash hadn't. Piles upon piles of clay, stone, and other unidentifiable materials lay haphazardly on the ground and mixed in with the contorted frames. On either side of what used to be one of the entrances stood giant platforms that had once held the guardians of the city, though nothing remained. Elovy's hastened pace slowed to a halt as she stared at the ruin in front of the group. "We were just here," she whispered. "It feels like that anyway. The breaking couldn't have caused all of this, could it? Where is everyone?" Her voice caught in her throat. Ahvora wrapped one arm around her sister's shoulder, letting Elovy turn into her. It had been a long time since Elovy had allowed herself to be held that way. She took a shuddering breath before pulling away and wiping the tears from her cheek. "Wouldn't this be a bad time to ask where the welcoming committee is?" Uriel's lopsided grin faded at the sight of his sister's expressions. "Just trying to lighten the mood." He started forward again, letting the others fall in behind. When they crossed the threshold of the city, the familiar tingle of old magic that used to protect and provide for Heretta was absent. More uneasy glances passed between them, but they didn't stop. The further they ventured among the wreckage, more evidence of chaos appeared. Elovy kept her eyes on the road ahead, but the other three let their gazes roam over the shattered remains. Formerly grand columns lay in shatters along the road, having been blasted from their perches. Lumps of mottled gray ashes became frequent as they walked, more ash dusting their cloaks, endlessly falling from above. Ahvora's chest tightened as she recalled the planar storms that had been in the far northern part of the city when the breaking began, where she had been separated from her siblings. Screams everywhere, stones thudded all around, and metal screeched. In the moment, she had frozen. She had found an archaic stone door built into a hill, and she hid there, waiting for it all to stop. "Ahvora, are you all right?" Uriel nudged her arm with his. Shaking her head to rid herself of the memory's remnants, she said, "Sorry, what?" "I was saying," Akasi said with a raised eyebrow, "that we ought to find shelter soon." "Oh, right. Let's go a little further, see if we can find somewhere relatively stable." They hadn't gone but 10 paces further when the raven's grip on Ahvora tightened, then suddenly loosened as the bird took flight and disappeared into the encroaching darkness. A single feather started drifting to the ground, but Ahvora caught it. "What? That thing's leading us here just to disappear on us?" Uriel peered upwards, trying to catch sight of the raven again. "Wouldn't be the first time," Ahvora muttered, pocketing the feather. A bone-chilling cold crept over the four of them, a cold deeper than the dead of winter, right into their cores. It took several moments for anyone to move. Akasi managed to break through first and shook Elovy. "It's down that way." He pointed to the right. More debris covered the road, but barely visible further down, there was an enormous shadow lurking with nothing around that could have cast it. Uriel and Ahvora started when Akasi spoke. Ahvora reached across and behind to check that her quiver was still in reach, but didn't withdraw an arrow yet. "Let's keep going. Maybe it hasn't seen us." Elovy still didn't move. Uriel and Akasi exchanged a look and a nod. Uriel took the other elf's pack, then Akasi lifted Elovy as easily as he might a child. The sudden movement jarred Elovy from her trance and set her screaming. "Elovy!" Uriel hissed. "Stop!" Too late. Ahvora grabbed an arrow and knocked it. She glanced at Uriel, at Elovy, then finally at Akasi. "Keep them safe. Go." Akasi didn't need to be told twice. He took off at a steady jog, cradling Elovy securely against his chest. "You can't stop that thing." Uriel reached for his older sister's arm, but she dodged his grasp. "I'm trying to give you time." Despite the growing pit in her stomach and her racing heartbeat, she gave Uriel a reassuring smile. "I'll catch up. I'm faster, remember? Get out of here." Ahvora turned her attention back to the dark shadow. She heard Uriel growl his disapproval, then his footsteps retreating. "Breathe in, breathe out. Aim, draw back, breathe in, let it roll." Ahvora repeated aloud the words taught to her many cycles before as her body obeyed. A wretched howling scream pierced the air as her arrow hit true. In a flash, another arrow was in her hand, ready to knock. Her left hand gripped the middle of the bow as the right put the arrow in place. As she took aim again, she murmured with a smirk on her face, "I promised you I would always protect them, Mother."